Good morning, students. In our previous class, we have finished about pollination, its types, that is autogamy, geitonogamy, or xenogamy, or allogamy, that is self-fertilization and cross-fertilization, and also about the inbreeding depression, which is taking place during when the plants undergo only self-pollination. Okay, so to overcome those inbreeding depression, we have studied some devices which help to avoid the self pollination and encourages the cross pollination. Okay, so one more thing about like the difference between self pollination and cross pollination, because self pollination takes place within the same flower or two different flower in a same plant, so they don't need much agents for the pollination, means they don't need anyone's help to transfer the gametes from one place to or one flower to another flower. But in cross pollination, what happens, as we have studied, the cross pollination takes place between two different flowers of two different plants. So what they need agents for pollination. So in this class we are going to deal with the agents of pollination, especially for the cross pollination. So we know already what is cross pollination. Yes, so pollination takes place between the different flowers of different plants. So because of the pollination is between two different plants, so it helps to increase what, the genetic diversity. They show the genetic diversity, and also what they prevents, the inbreeding depression. Already we have studied what is inbreeding depression. What happens if the plants continuously undergo self pollination or they show self pollination? As we know, there is no genetic variation. Because of there is no genetic variation, what happens, the later generations of plants, they may lose the important characters or traits which is present in their ancestral plants or their parent generation. Okay, so in this diagram you can see diagrammatically the self pollination as well as cross pollination. Okay, now we'll come to agents of pollination. So agents of pollination are of two types, two important types based on their category. Okay, that is abiotic pollinators or biotic pollinators, or abiotic factors or abiotic factors. Abiotic factors are the one which are non-living factors. Biotic factors are living factors. So here the abiotic factors are, one is water and another is wind. Okay, in biotic factors there may be insects, birds, animals, etc. Okay, so we'll study one by one. What is so based on the agents, there are different kinds of pollination. As I said, the pollinators sometimes may be wind, then such kind of pollination we call it as anemophily. So don't get confused, anemo means doesn't means animals. Okay, it means wind. Here the animals we call it as zoophily. Okay, so remember, anemophily indicates pollination by wind. Hydrophily indicates pollination by water. We know what is hydro indicates. It indicates water. Anemophily is a wind. Zoophily is animals. Okay, what kind of animals? There are different kind of animals. So if sometimes if the pollinating agents are birds, okay, then the pollination we call it as ornithophily. If it is by bats, chiropterophily. If it is by snails or slugs, we call it as malacophily. And if it is by insects, it is called as entomophily. Okay, remember, anemophily is wind, hydrophily is water, zoophilies are animals, and based on the types of animals, ornithophily indicates birds. Okay, chiropterophily indicates bats, malacophily snails and slugs, entomophily insects. Okay, so we'll start with one by one, starting with anemophily. What is anemophily? What is the agent of pollination here? Wind is the agent of pollination. Okay, so here are some examples, that is coconut palm, date palm, maize, grasses, and cannabis. Okay, all these are the plants where the pollination is done by with the help of wind. Okay, so in the beside diagram you can see, so it is a maize plant which consists of, yes, uh, two different kinds of inflorescence, that is male inflorescence and female inflorescence. As I said, staminate flower and pistillate flower. Okay, so these are two. Then see the difference there, the male inflorescence and the female inflorescence, they need to travel, right, to get transferred on the stigma of the uh, like gynoecium. So what happens, wind helps them to get transported. Okay, so in such plants, what are the characteristics? Okay, the plants which undergo anemophily, like pollination by a wind, what such plants characteristics called as, or flowers characteristics? The first characteristics are, the flowers are colorless, odorless, and nectarless. Color, odor, and nectar are meant to attract the insects or birds. But here, wind as a pollinating agents, there is no use of any attracting thing. Okay, so hence, in such plants which is done by wind, the pollination, the flowers which are present in such plants are colorless, odorless, and nectarless. Another thing, the pollen grains are light, small, and winged, or dusty, sometimes dry, non-sticky, and unwettable. So because of all these characteristics of pollen grains, they can flow with the help of wind, okay, or breeze. Hence they are light, small, and sometimes winged. And next, stigma is hairy, feathery, or branched to catch the wind borne pollen grains. When the pollen grains are floating within the wind, through the wind, what happens? Because of the wind as a pollinating agent, the stigma becomes hairy and feathery to catch the pollen grains within the breeze. Okay, yes, so this is the characteristics. Next, pollen grains are produced in very large number. Why they are present in very large number? Because they don't know how much all the pollen grains, or nor even a one pollen grain can be settled on the surface of stigma, because on the surface of stigma. Why? Because of there is a wind, and there is no such a peculiar thing that they will go and land on the stigma. So because of this, what happens, the male flower produces as much as pollen grains. Okay, so that within that thousands of pollen grains, at least 100 of pollen grains, there is a chance to get land on the stigma of the flower. Hence they produce maximum pollen grains. Okay, so next, these are the some examples or the characteristics. As I said, stigma is feathery. Here you can see the structure of stigma and the structure of anther. Okay, where they are loosely arranged, which helps them to produce maximum pollen grains and easy exposing the pollen. Okay, see, can you see here, this is a example of gymnosperms cones, where there is a dispersal of pollen grains. This dusty patches are nothing but pollen grains. Okay, so here also you can see these are anthers. Okay, and there are feathery stigmas. You can see there are feathery stigmas here. So this is the structure of a flower, where specially they undergo anemophily. See, dispersal of Anthers, pollen grains here, these are nothing but pollen grains which are dispersing. Okay, so next we'll go to hydrophily, means here water is an agency or agent of pollination. Example, Joostera and Vallisneria. So these two are aquatic plants, the plants which is present in water. So all plants has its specific kind of pollinators. Okay, if just imagine the plants are present in water, okay, so they are meant to take help from the water itself for the pollination. Okay, sometimes insects also can be helped, but maximum time if they are submerged within the water, then water is the only agent for pollination. Okay, so when the flower or any flower is exposed above the water, then it sometimes it may be by wind or sometimes by insects, like you can see lotus flower. Okay, though the plant is submerged but the flower is exposed outside the water, above the water. So what happens there? Water can't be a pollinator. Okay, so where in such condition wind also takes place, wind also called as pollinators or some insects or birds. Okay, so here hydrophily is basically meant to like water pollinating agents, and they may ask the question on Vallisneria, like what happens, what kind of adaptation which is taken by Vallisneria plant to undergo hydrophily, they may ask. Okay, these are the characters of flowers which are present in submerged water or the aquatic plants. So what happens here? The flowers are small and inconspicuous. So flower is very small. Okay, okay, they are not attractive or broader, they are very small. So nectar and odor are absent. Yes, here also why the nectar and odor are absent, because they are not attracting any animals here like birds or insects. Here the typically the pollination is by water. Next, pollen grains are light and unwettable due to the presence of mucilage cover. So what happens? Because sometimes, can you see here the male inflorescence in the beside diagram? Male inflorescence are within the water. So what happens when the pollen grains are dispersed from this male flower? They are present in the water. So because of water, what happens when we keep any normal polar grain or any grains within the water? There will be imbibition. In the last previous subject we have studied. So what happens? There will be swelling of the things when we keep it in a water, right? So here also, to avoid that, okay, to keep the viability of pollen grains, what happens? One is the pollen grain is light, so hence they can go up and float above the water and they can reach the female flower. That is one condition. Another, unwettable, as I said, if they have get swollen, what happens? Maybe they lose their viability, maybe they get destroyed. So to not get destroyed, what happens? They are covered with a mucilage, mucus layer, so hence they won't get wet. And next, stigma is long, sticky but unwettable. How the pollen grains are unwettable? In the same way, stigma should be unwettable. Okay, next, stigma are sometimes sticky. Why it is sticky? Because of when the male flowers are floating on the surface of water, when they come in contact with the stigma, they get attached to the stigma. Because of the water current, they may be flow fastly, pollen grains. So to avoid that, when the flowers, like in Vallisneria, you can see flowers are like exposed outside. See, can you see the female flower, and the male flowers or the pollen grains are floating? So what happens? Because of the sticky nature of stigma, all these floating pollen grains get attached to the stigma and they perform next post pollination process. Okay, so these are the some characteristics of hydrophily, and you can write the same characteristics for Vallisneria also. Okay, so next is entomophily. Entomophily is of where the agents are insects. Here the agents sometimes are moths, butterflies, wasps, bees and beetles, etc. And one more thing, within all these insects, bees are the important pollinators of maximum flowers. Okay, they say 70% of pollination within the flower will be taking place with the help of bees only, like with the help of insects. Within the insects, bees, honeybees. Okay, so what are the characters of such flowers where they perform entomophily? They are showy or brightly colored. Yes, obviously, to attract the insects, what happens? The flowers are very varied colored. They are very showy, brightly colored. Most insect pollinated flowers have a landing platform. Because of the insects they are going to pollinate, they should land on the surface of flower to get to suck the nectar or to collect the pollen grain sometimes. Because of that, they have a proper landing surface within the flower. Next, pollen grains are spiny sometimes, like spiny we can see in hibiscus. The pollen grains are spiny, heavy and surrounded by a yellow oil sticky substance called pollen kit. So this is are meant for to get attached to the insect's body, or it may be insect's wings or legs or abdomen. So this pollen grains, when the insects will land on the flower, because of this pollen grains characteristics, pollen grains get attached to the body of the insects. So what happens when the insect go to the another flower? When they move their body or move their wings or legs, what happens? The attached pollen grains get detached and they may land on the surface of stigma, so that they help in the fertilization, like pollination process. So stigmas are often inserted and sticky. Some flowers provide safe place to insects for laying eggs. Example, yucca is one of the flower where the insects can even lay the eggs also. Okay, so this is the ladybird beetle, butterfly. So you can see a beautiful landing surface surrounded with anthers, and these are petals, varied colored, brightly colored. Okay, which attracts the insects. So as I told, honeybees are the important pollinators which plays an important role in the pollination. That is 70% of pollination will be performed by the honeybees. So you can see that yellow dust which is all over the body of the honeybee, that is the pollen grains. Okay, and in the hind leg, okay, in the hind leg, what happens? They contain a pollen basket containing pollen grains. Here I have labeled it. So this is where they goes on collecting the pollen grains, and they deposit such pollen grains in the honeybee hives. Okay, so this is what they do. Next is ornithophily. Already we have started zoophily. Within that, insects we have finished, that is entomophily. And the second one is by the birds. That is one of the beautiful example for bird pollinating agents are hummingbirds. Okay, so what are the characters of flowers? So ornithophilous flowers are usually brightly colored, red, orange, yellow or blue. Yes, why they are so much brightly colored? To attract the birds. The floral parts are commonly leathery. So ornithophilous flowers secretes abundant watery nectar or have edible parts, because they contain watery nectar and edible parts. Though the birds will come and they seek for the food. So during this, the pollen grains will be attached to the birds and they get transferred to the different flowers. Okay, So these are the hummingbirds which are sucking the nectar, the watery nectar, sometimes edible part of flowers also. Yes, so these are some examples. Okay, there is no such explanation in your syllabus. Just remember, if the pollinating agent is bat, then the pollination is called as chiropterophily. So these are some cactus plant flowers. Okay, so where they feed. So these are the example. And within the zoophily, like within the mammals, one of the mammals, there is an unusual pollinating agent called as a lemur. This is the picture of a lemur, a kind of a mammal which also undergo, like they feed on the fruits or they feed on the flowers. During that time they help in the pollination. That is one unusual pollinating agent. So other things are like extra, like by snakes if it is done, then ophiophily. If by snails, malacophily, already we have studied. Myrmecophily if it is by ants. Okay, these are some examples. I had given pictures. This flower is called as Erythema Chinese cobra lily, which attracts the snakes. These are snail vine plant which attracts snail, where they perform pollination. These are some ants called as pollinating agents. Okay, there are many we have studied. Within that, I would like to differentiate what is the difference between abiotic agent and biotic agent. Abiotic agent, I have taken example of wind, that is anemophily, and biotic I have taken insect, that is entomophily. So we'll try to differentiate what are the characteristics of the flowers of biotic agent and abiotic agent. Okay, so features I had given here along with the insect pollinated flowers and wind pollinated flowers. So comes to the petals, or it is all related to the flowers only. In insect pollinated, what will be the flower structure? Like petals, it may be large, colored, scented, okay, which helps to attract the insects. But what happens in wind pollinated? They must be small or sometimes absent also. Okay, like absent means not flowers are absent. Flowers are like they are not large, or these color thing or scented things may be absent. So next, nectar produced by nectarines which attracts the insects. Again, this is sweet liquid. Okay, sweet in composition liquid, we call it as a nectar. Okay, which is formed by the flowers for to perform the germination of pollen grain. These nectars are imported within the flower, okay, which allow the pollen to get germinated. Even in the same time, this nectars will what happens, they attract the insects, sometimes birds also. Okay, so the same thing which is absent in wind pollinated, because here there is no need to attract the insects or birds. Okay, because the pollination is by especially the non-living agents, that is wind or sometimes water. So stamen, okay, always present in inside the flower. Here it is a long filaments. Why? Because of it is by the wind, right? If it is present within the flower, then by the wind the anther can't be the pollen grain which is present in the anther can't be dispersed easily. So hence in wind pollinated, they are very exposed kind filaments, okay, so that the pollen grains are dispersed nicely within the wind. So here also the stigma, very small, sticky inside the flowers. but here it is large, leathery, we know. The reason is uh, pollinating agents are wind here. So next, pollens are smaller amount because it is by the insects. So the insect itself, what happens, the pollen grains are get attached to the insect's body so that they can transport those pollen grains easily. But here what happens, because of the wind, the chances of getting transport is or transfer is very less. Okay, because of this they are produced in a large amount. Okay, then one more thing, they are not sticky, they are light, easily carried by wind. So next, bracts, that is modified leaves, here it is absent and sometimes here it is present. So these are the some characteristics or features or differentiating character. They may ask, what is the characteristics of insect pollinated flowers, wind pollinated flowers, water pollinated flowers, bird pollinated flowers? Like this they may ask. Okay, these are the important things you should remember. Okay, so I hope you remembered everything. So these are the things what we have finished. Ornithophily, thank you.